Host Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne Lowe, where we will connect our Orthodox faith to day-to-day living and relationships to our family, work, and our view of ourselves. Father Nicholas is the priest at St. John the Divine Greek Orthodox Church in Jacksonville, and Dr. Roxanne is a licensed clinical psychologist who uses her extensive training in private practice. Questions are welcome by calling 855-237-2346. That's 855-237-2346. Here now is Father Nicholas and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, hello everyone, and welcome to Live with the Louhs. Such a blessing to have all of you with us this evening. We're so excited that you're here and joining us on this special program of Live with the Louhs on this Tuesday, August 13th. You know, before we just share with you our extraordinary guest that we have this evening, I wanted to just remind all of you to stay connected to us through our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and on YouTube. In fact, all of our sermons are archived on our YouTube channel, and all of these can be found on our under the search engine of the Louhs. So just simply go into your search engine, put in the Louhs, that's Louhs, and you'll have access to what we're posting throughout the week, as well as our sermons. And also, if you wanted to subscribe to our daily inspirational messages, we started doing these several years ago. You can go to our website at thelouhs.com and then /subscribe. That way you can subscribe, and every day in your email inbox, you'll receive at 7 a.m. Our daily inspirational message. And if you're new to Live with the Louhs, one of the things that we really want to encourage you to know about us is that we try to merge both faith and psychology together. You know, Roxanne is a clinical psychologist, I'm a priest, and we try to merge in ways that our goal is that we give you some practical Christianity, ways that you can apply your faith every day of your life. Because I think for many of us, we can kind of hear a message or be connected to Christ, maybe in a service or a liturgy on a Sunday morning. Where we struggle the most is really applying it every day in our life. So we hope to kind of help to bridge those gaps and help you in your walk of faith. So again, thanks so much for being with us. And as always, we'd love to hear from you during the show. You can call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. The show is also being broadcast live on the Ancient Faith YouTube channel, as well as our own the Louhs YouTube, the Louhs Facebook page, actually. And you can just simply leave a comment in the comment line there, and our producer Matushka Trudy will make sure that she gets that to all of us. So again, we'd love to hear from you. So make a point to call us or leave us a comment. So today we're going to talk about a topic that I think for so many people is such a struggle with. You know, if there was one area that I think many people struggle with in their everyday life, it is to learn to forgive people. All of us have experienced times in our life when people have offended us, hurt us, maybe have said things that just really cut us at the very core of our life. Sometimes those are people that are close to us. They're part of our sphere of influence, the people that are in our family. But sometimes they're people that are maybe even outside. And oftentimes we can kind of carry that unforgiveness, not just for that moment, but we can carry it for long periods of time. It's often been said that forgiveness is setting a prisoner free, only to realize that we are the ones who are unforgiving. We are that prisoner. And so we thought we would dedicate this show tonight to learning and practicing forgiveness, and why it was so important to Christ to share that with us throughout his time here on earth, and also while on the cross. So we thought we'd invite a dear friend of ours. Her name is Paula Huston, and she's the author of this new book called Forgiveness: Following Jesus into Radical Loving. I love that title, Forgiveness: Following Jesus into Radical Loving. So let me tell you a little bit about her. She's a long time Camaldolese Benedictine oblate, and is the author of 2 novels and 8 works of spiritual nonfiction. Her most recent titles are The Hermits of Big Sur and One Ordinary Sunday, a meditation on the mystery of the Mass. She's a National Endowment of the Arts Fellow in Creative Writing. She taught in 2 MFA programs, served as the president of the National Christian Writers Organization called the Chrysostom Society, and has been part of the oblate formation team for New Camaldoli Hermitage for over 10 years. She and her husband Michael live on 4 acres on the central coast of California, where they grow olives for oil, keep chickens and bees, and enjoy the company of their interesting and admirable General Z grandchildren. I love how you wrote that. That's so cute. Paula, thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to Live with the Louhs.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's wonderful to be with both of you. In fact, I didn't say this ahead of time, but I very nearly became Orthodox instead of Catholic when I finally returned to my Christian faith after a 20-year hiatus. I grew up as a Lutheran, and when I was drawn back to it, I was definitely drawn back to the more ancient version of Christianity. And if I had not run into the monks up at New Camaldoli, who are Roman Catholic, I very likely would have kept going toward the Orthodox. I was really, really drawn to that particular practice of the faith. So it looks like you're both doing wonderful work in that. Well,
by God's grace, I just want to kind of start us out by asking you, what was the genesis behind writing this book, Forgiveness and Following Jesus in Radical Loving?
I think, well, first of all, I have to admit it was not my idea initially. There was an editor at Paraclete Press who suggested it to me. And, initially I thought, could I even tackle that topic? Because it's such a huge and difficult topic. It's very complex. There's so many different people, and even God. I think a lot of people have a grudge they're holding toward even God that we have to let go of and forgive. And so I didn't know whether I could even rise to the project. But then I began thinking about the fact that here I was, an adult with all these years of living behind me, and I was still at somewhere deep inside hanging on to this childhood anger toward my own poor mother, who was quite old by then. And that had continued to interfere with our relationship, even as she got to the place where she was sick and needing help. And I was the main person, the oldest of her 5 kids, and the one that lived closest to her. So that fell on my shoulders. It kept bringing it up on a daily basis, almost, that, this needs to be somehow dealt with. And so I think that it was a personal impulse toward trying to figure out what might be blocking that, because I sincerely wanted to get past that obstacle in our relationship. We could never have the kind of, easy, natural relationship she had with the other 4 kids in the family. And they could never figure out why I didn't have that either, And so I would have to say that was probably a big motivator for me.
So I'm so curious about the resistance that you discovered as you maybe looked at your own journey and maybe at some of the journeys of others who've crossed your path. I don't think we have to look too far to find people who are struggling in some level of injustice or something that just felt so wrong that they couldn't get past or struggling to get past. And so, maybe we could kind of dive into some of what you've discovered as maybe some of the beliefs that may have been blocking, that ability to move on, because as you said, you actually wanted to, and we're struggling to do so.
Yeah, well, I think on the personal level for me, there was a sense that an injustice had somehow been done to me when I was a child, when I was a very, very young child. And I couldn't put a finger on what that was, but I felt that somehow I had been deeply wronged by my poor mom, who I think was probably pretty innocent, was just going through a very rough psychological time in her own life. And, this was a woman who'd grown up during the Depression. Her family had suffered a lot. She experienced hunger as a child. And then as a teenager, her brother was going off to World War II and came back, with what back then they referred to as shell shock and all these things. And then she married a World War II vet that she met on campus, my dad, just returning from the war. So he had his own set of things to deal with. She had hers, and they were doing the best they could. But somehow me as number one child for these two people who were still pretty deeply burdened by their own childhoods, their own difficult times as young people. I think I took the brunt of their learning curve, and anyway, so to go back to your bigger question, I think that sense of injustice really is huge, and there's something about forgiving a person who you feel has committed a great injustice, either to you personally or on a bigger stage, you know, that feels as though it's not in service of justice. You know, how can this be just to just say, well, I'm letting go of my anger toward you. I'm letting go of my sense of outrage. I'm just going to give you a free pass here, you know? And I think that sticks in people's throats. And we can see it all over the world, all through human history, in areas where there have been ongoing struggles and conflicts, like Northern Ireland was for so long.
Right.
Like we're seeing right now in Israel with Gaza and Palestine, that these become they become part of a cultural story, just like my mom's injustice that I suspected from back then without any real evidence became part of my own story of my life, my own personal narrative. I'm this way because of what she did, you know, or her, somehow she failed, and so therefore I am not responsible for whatever this thing in myself that I don't like and wish weren't there. Well, it's not my fault. It was my mom's fault. And I think that can get, you know, multiplied and extrapolated to all kinds of gigantic conflicts around the world. If it weren't for them, we would be better people, you know?
So the blame, the finger pointing is a big one that we have to get past.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It's interesting because, you know, what I really hear you saying is that we all have a task, some level of personal accountability and responsibility, despite our bigger story, despite our obstacles and what we've come up against. At the end of the day, we still have our own task to complete. If I didn't feel worth, if I didn't feel loved, if I didn't feel, I can't go out replicating that or taking that out on and then replaying my scenario. At the end of the day, how do I create my own instead of living in reaction to this thing that happened? And that's, you know, so I don't know if you find that in sort of going into this journey more, but that point of self-reflection where people kind of turn away from the thing that happened and onto themselves as what now and how do I move forward, that's a real sticky point for people because, you know, don't blame me. This isn't my, you know, this isn't my task. This was what happened to me. But we are so much more than what happened to us, right? And still have these bigger stories. So how long did it take for you to sort of come to that point of, you know, reflection and this, she had her own psychological distress and her own story. I mean, that's so compassionate and empathetic and involves so much looking into her story and certainly made a lot of sense. But you probably had to reflect a little bit within to be able to reach that moment.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I think probably the only reason I was able to embark on that long journey of self-reflection, looking within, is because that's very much at the core of monastic practice. And I had become so involved with this community of contemplative monks. In fact, I began visiting the Hermitage back in 1991. So by now, this has been well over 30 years of just, you know, it's a very small community, but being with that community, slowly becoming friends on a personal basis with a number of the monks, and then watching how they worked out, because they're all quite different people, but they're living in very close proximity to one another, and they've taken a vow to do this for the rest of their lives. So it's sort of like getting married to 14 of your brothers, you know, for the rest of your life. So relationships are just completely key. The health of those relationships is very, very important to keep that community together. And I began knowing that all of them would have their own personal life story, their own things that happened to them. And somehow they had to start learning what made them tick and why they would respond this way to this grumpy monk, and what that was reflecting back to. Maybe they had a grumpy dad that they never forgave, so I think it was learning the ascetical practices of that ancient monastic order, because they're actually as old as Mount Athos. They're one of the oldest of the continuous. They maybe not quite as old, but I think 1025 is when Camaldoli was founded. So they go way back and share, much of what you all would have taught in your own Orthodox tradition about how we get to know ourselves and know what makes us tick. And a lot of that is coming up against something that seems immovable. We can't get past this, and why? Why is it we can't get past this? And so I think one thing I would have to say about my quest to truly forgive Mom is that it went in some stages, and sometimes with a whole lot of time in between. There was the original realization way back when I was probably in my late 20s, early 30s, that I got to get past this. This is getting in my way. But then some years between that first realization and actually actively beginning to try to take steps in that direction. And of course, Mom kept blowing it, because every time we would start to get closer, she would say something or do something, that would trip all those old triggers again. But just over the passage of time, helping her through her old age and her death, which took place about 12 years ago, being with her at the very moment she took her last breath. I mean, literally holding her face in my hands. And having said the words to her, before that happened, I forgive you, and I hope you forgive me for these hard years we've lived together. Because it was clear we loved each other. That wasn't the issue. It was this old block in the way. And then I'll be surprised, like out of the blue, suddenly, 2, 3, 4 years after she's been gone, suddenly a scene will come up, and I'll see it in a different way. A scene will come up with Mom in it and me in it, even as a child, and I'll see the whole thing in a different way. And I realize I'm understanding more. I'm understanding more, and that this may go on for the rest of my life. Oddly, but it's easier now to see that as a really rich and fertile situation in which I'm being required to grow. I can't just stop that process. God is there. God has given me a lot of tools to help me work through it. And that this is part of the whole transformative work we're supposed to be undergoing as Christians.
I love that. If you're just tuning in, this is we are interviewing Paula Huston on her brand new book, Forgiveness, Following Jesus into Radical Loving. If you've got a question for Paula, we'd love to hear from you. You can call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. Or if you want to leave a comment on Ancient Faith's YouTube page, that's where we're also broadcasting, as well as on the Louhs Facebook page, please feel free to leave a comment there. We'll definitely get to it during the show if time allows. But again, if you have a question on forgiveness, if you're struggling to forgive someone and maybe just need some guidance, you can call us and totally be anonymous. Our producer, Matushka Trudy, will make sure that that is the case. Paul, I can't help but think about how you were just sharing how you see things so differently, or at least differently now when you have these scenes from from life as a child, where prior to this forgiveness that would kind of come over your heart, prior to that you may have seen it in a much more, I would say, maybe negative way or an unhealthy way. And I think for so many people, a lot of times the narrative that we tell ourselves, or the story that we follow, sometimes can lead us towards the negative. And if we can talk about the fact that, we live in a world right now where everything is so focused on the me, this is what you did to me. This is, and obviously, we don't want to minimize the fact that people do get hurt and people have had things that are just unbelievable and unbearable. But how do you think, or maybe explain to us how hard it is when we have a negative story or negative narrative that's in our mind, especially when we're living in a society that's really just focused on ourselves as opposed to reconciling with the other person?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's tough. And it was actually one of the great gifts, I think, that Jesus brought into the ancient world was the concept of, the person and the great value that we automatically have just because we are human beings who've been created by this loving, wonderful God. We're not random creatures or biological accidents or whatever. We're here. There's inherent meaning and purpose to our lives. And that was revolutionary in his day. I mean, the view of the self back then was much more connected to like a societal role that we're here to fulfill or whatever. But this business of looking at the individual human being as something special and worthy of great respect, it undergirds all of our whatever's good about Western civilization, and that whole tradition comes from this revolutionary idea of Jesus and his teachings about the value of each individual human being. That being said, in an era now we're living where many people no longer have the connection between that concept and God or faith of any kind, it kind of cuts that individual loose out there to float around and to find the sense of meaning and purpose that used to come sort of automatically because we were born into this whole Christian worldview. That's not there to a large degree anymore for people. And so it's something that even us as Christians who consider ourselves serious Christians, we're trying our best, but our whole experience of life is permeated by this other view. And so it's very easy even for us to fall into that trap of thinking, well, I am worthy of respect because I'm here. And the way we decide if we have self-respect or not is if we have self-esteem. And that isn't based on anything except the fact that we're here. And it makes us, I think, get sometimes fiercely defensive, self-defensive, when we feel as though someone is treading on that, our own concept of ourselves. And so if someone disrespects us, someone hurts us, someone betrays us, offends us in any way, it's really a big deal for us in this era where self-esteem is such a major part of how we see our purpose as human beings. I don't know if that's made sense.
Yes. Oh, gosh, what a beautiful and broad look you took at that. It is something that we're seeing in society, just a huge movement toward the self as opposed to the collective. And, I'm hoping, praying the pendulum begins to shift or something kind of brings this deeper perspective, the ability even to practice perspective taking, that there are two truths and two human beings and two experiences and two life stories and two collisions of everything that we feel. And, when you lean to one side, you can't really get past any of it. But interesting, you said a bit ago that I have to get past this. There was a moment where you realize I have to get past it. And so, it made me think, well, there must have been a value greater than the injustice that you were focused on, something that mattered more, that was sort of pushing you to get past it. For some people that could be, well, gosh, that's my partner and I have to see him and like him the next day, or for some people that's their mother and she's aging and she's getting older and I need to be present with her as she's sick. So other people, it could be guilt. Other people, it could be their own relationship with their own faith and their salvation, and they feel it's their moral duty. So I'm curious about the value that sort of mitigated it for you, and maybe if you could touch on how you think people might get past the self, what has to matter to them more in order to kind of push past that.
That's a really good question, because it kind of, it turns the whole thing back on motivation for why you would go down this trail. And I think for me, it was really simple. I got really tired of myself. I just did. I'd had this view of who I was for years and years. A lot of what felt distorted in my life, and I could sense that this isn't the right way to look at this particular thing, or this obsession with achievement is out of whack somehow. And going back to the strong influence the monks have had on me is just, they lived in kind of contradiction to a lot of the things that our society looks at as the highest and the best. They deliberately invert that, and in their quest for humility and even anonymity, it flips what our overarching culture tells us are the important things. And so I think that's what I kept running into is I'm obsessing over this particular thing. In my case, it was toward becoming a super successful writer. I mean, I was really caught up in that. And as I began to disentangle my life story with Mom and this thing getting in the way of us being able to be good friends with one another, I realized part of it was that I had always believed that I could only earn Mom's love through achievement. And so then I had to start not only looking at that part of the story and was that really true or not, but then looking at, well, is that the point of life, to achieve, at the highest level? Or is there some other point to life? Is there a way to live that doesn't put, center that in the middle of everything? And so I think that's what I'd have to say, that I got tired of being who I was. And suddenly it occurred to me, I didn't have to be that way anymore. I could learn to be a different, that people did change, and I wasn't set in stone. And these automatic responses I had to different kinds of things, negative and positive, those were habitual responses. I had always responded that way. Why couldn't I change that habit of responding? And that was really kind of an exciting adventure to embark on, to see if, wow, can I change my relationship, for example, to food? I had, like a lot of high achieving people, I always walked around with a cartload of anxiety, performance anxiety all the time. Am I going to measure up? Well, the way I would calm that anxiety down was, like a lot of people, you find comfort food and you eat, so then I was always in a battle with my own body about overeating, having to lose weight, can I button my jeans? Am I going to have to go back on a diet? Blah, 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 for years, until again, that thread then started getting pulled in that narrative of my life. And I realized, no, this can change. And it has, but yeah, we are very complex creatures.
We are so complex.
We really are. We are baffling.
It's amazing because when people, come into my office, most of the time, they're there to find out, why do I do what I do? Okay, so we have a lot of theories about human behavior and how we approach it. And interestingly, what I always sort of settle into is the notion that it is not one variable. It's this sort of complex interaction of how all of these variables in your life have come together to create the very picture of the life that you live. And so, can we ever point it back to one thing? Right. I don't know. I mean, I think that that may have been the foundation for how it evolved, what provoked it. But then,
We're a sum total of those experiences.
I mean, absolutely. So you did some really interesting work, and I think it opens people's minds up to kind of study themselves in relation to what has happened. Who am I because of that? How am I living in relation to that? Why do I do what I do? And how many of these are reactions, and how many of these are actually like values I carry and should continue to do because they fit my life story?
Right.
And so maybe we can kind of transition for a moment to kind of talk about the difference between, real hurt and maybe just a wounded ego, speaking of the self.
Right. And, I would have to say that, especially in the kind of society in which we live right now, that probably the best bet is to start with the theory it could be a wounded ego, begin at that place first and examine that first before we go straight to the depths of, I've been completely wounded for the rest of my life. I'll never recover from this. I think that the way I kind of worked all through this was to, again, look at the narrative I had constructed, and how had whatever had just happened to me, how did it intersect with that narrative in a painful way, and is this an area that then I could peek in a little further into the great mystery of how I became how I am, and see was this I don't know, somebody referred to these parts of our nature as we have these loose planks, we have these weak planks in there, and you'll suddenly step on it and you won't even realize, oh wow, that was a way bigger fall, than should have occurred based on what just happened. So I think trying to look at the situation as clearly as possible, even when we're really upset, because obviously most of the time we're caught up in a lot of anger when we're hurt or we feel betrayed. And it's hard. Anger was one of those things that the ancient, Christianity has a lot to say about, a lot of wisdom about anger. I'm trying to remember, you guys might remember which one of the Desert Fathers compared it to a good sheepdog. We need anger because anger warns us of maybe threat, impending danger that we need to pay attention to. The barking energizes us to step up to whatever the situation might be. But if that sheepdog isn't well trained, it could keep going and attack and do all kinds of terrible damage.
Such wisdom. It's so true today.
I know, exactly. And it's zeal. And so I think as we try to look at this hurt that's just occurred, or this sense of being deeply offended or whatever, first of all, realizing that we're blinded momentarily, hopefully it's only momentarily, by that flash of anger, and acknowledging we're not seeing straight. We can't really analyze what just happened. We can't really assess the damage right now because we're too mad. And then trying our best to do, again, as the ancient monks would have said, don't nurture it. Like, don't cling to that. Don't keep running through in our heads over and over again, that kind of rumination about what just happened. Because each time the story gets better. It gets more exciting and more terrible and more unjust, and we add details.
Isn't that so true? That's so true. I think the more that you spend time thinking about that story, you kind of, I'm sure, add things to it without even realizing it, and what their intent was, and especially if, where we are in that moment, if we are tired or exhausted or dealing with someone else that's offended us, how we kind of just compile that on each other. But Paula, we're up against a break right now. We want to take a quick break, and on the other side of the break, we really want to get into the practical ways. Like, what are some steps that we can take today to help us in forgiving and being much more of a forgiving type people? So, for those of you that are tuning in, stay right with us. We'll be right back.
Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne. Live with the Louhs with Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne will be back in a moment. Give them a call at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. They would love to hear from you.
During his darkest moments on the cross, Jesus uttered 7 statements. His words offer us principles to live by, lessons of hope, peace, and comfort. I'm Dr. Roxanne Lowe.
And I'm Father Nicholas Lowe.
And our new book, 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, is all about how Christ's light transcends our darkness.
Christ's final words have the power to bring us into the light of his love and protection, providing wisdom and direction to follow when we face our own dark seasons. Get your copy today by going to store.ancientfaith.com. That's store.ancientfaith.com.
We're back with Live with the Louhs and Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne. Do you have a question for the Louhs? Call in now at 855-237-2346. That's 855-AF-RADIO. Here once again is Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to Live with the Louhs. Such a blessing to have you all here with us this evening. We have an extraordinary guest in Paula Huston. She's the author of a great book called Forgiveness, Following Jesus into Radical Loving. You can find this book at Paraclete Press. Once again, that's Forgiveness, Following Jesus into Radical Loving. And we've been talking about how difficult it is to forgive and the narratives that we create in our mind and how difficult sometimes to get those thoughts out of our mind, and also not only to take those out of our mind, but to create a system or a process in which we're forgiving people who have offended us and hurt us. And so we welcome you to call us if you've been offended or you've been hurt, or there's something that's been weighing on your heart that you'd like to talk about with regards to forgiveness or unforgiveness. Please feel free to call us at 1-855-237-2346. That's 1-855-237-2346. And feel free, if you'd like to be anonymous, please let our producer know, and she'll make sure that takes place. So, Paul, right before the break, we were talking about the differences between a wounded ego or just real hurt, kind of differentiating those two and how we can experience that when we get angry or upset. But as we're kind of going to the second half of our show, I'd love to spend some time really with some specific practices that we can start to do as people to make ourselves a much more forgiving people. Because I think one of the hardest things for people to do is that we know we need to forgive. We hear the Bible verses, we hear Christ telling us, the importance of forgiveness. We hear that in the Lord's Prayer, but I think we oftentimes struggle with simply just doing that and really helping our thoughts do that as well. So let's start sharing with our listeners tonight, what are some specific practices that we can start putting into place to be a forgiving people?
Yeah, I think we've already talked about some of the first ones that are not easy to put into place, but they're very helpful. One would be becoming aware of our habitual way of responding to something, and just the more aware we are of it, the less it's going to sneak up on us. Mm-hmm. So, just watching ourselves as we respond to some kind of offense or hurt, and realizing that's a habitual way of acting, and that means that I do have the power to change that. If mm-hmm. I can, with the help of God, I can make that change. And then I think I mentioned how already that looking upon these kind of really troubling, difficult relational situations as actually this unbelievably rich and fertile ground for mm-hmm. learning something very deep about ourselves and about life and about other people and about loving. Seeing it, turning it from a disaster in some ways into some kind of opportunity. That's not mm-hmm. always possible. Sometimes the hurt is so deep and severe and devastating that you can't think that way. But for many things, that can work too, like mm-hmm. turning trouble on its head, sort of, rather mm-hmm. than letting it take us down, but seeing it as an opportunity. One of the most beautiful things I learned from just, being part of that monastic community for so many years, but it was the work of Evagrius of Ponticus, the great 4th century Desert Father, who wrote about the 8 thoughts. And they're just so wise, how there's, of course, more than 8 thoughts that can screw us up, but these really cover a lot of ground. And the first is gluttony, which is one I have had little sore fights with gluttony for years and years. It was just part of the family culture that we turned to food in times of anxiety. And lust, and Plato, and I can't remember which work of Plato's said it, but they had an older man who said, yeah, there's a point where that one goes away, and that's a great relief. But for most of us, we grapple with that side of our nature our whole life. Avarice, the longing for possessions and other things. So if that's what's spurring us and pushing us, that's our main impetus through life, is a kind of deep avaricious view of life. We're going to really be angry with anybody who gets in the way of that, And so that's another way to start taking apart a situation that seems so hurtful or whatever. Oh, if the root of that is my need to get ahead because I want, I don't feel safe unless I have all these possessions, maybe that's what I need to change, instead of holding this grudge against this other person. And then there's the last of the 5, there's sadness, which is, that's very baffling, I think, to people today. What's wrong with being sad? I've always seen it more as a kind of self-pity. If only this had happened, and this had happened, and this had happened, and life had been fair, that can really take us down too. Anger, we've already talked about. And then there's acedia, which is a kind of sloth, especially when it comes to spiritual matters. I always think of that one as a kind of demon of futility. It's whatever we set out to do, especially in our spiritual lives. It's like, what's the point? It's not going to change anything. Life is going to get us in the end or whatever. And it's a kind of almost a nihilistic view of things. And then there's vainglory, which I suffered from for so many years, and I can still feel that little guy popping up on all kinds of occasions, looking good in front of the world, getting praise or whatever. That for me has been a place where a lot of the big offenses on the part of others that I've had to forgive have come because they crashed into my vainglory. They didn't give me the praise I was due for all my hard work or whatever. And so that makes it easier to forgive when I see that, this is really the issue here. It's not that this person did something so badly to me. It's that I've got this problem with vainglory. And finally, pride, which is, it's like standing next to God every morning and putting our arm around his shoulder and saying, what are the two of us going to be up to today? And people, when we suffer from a prideful view of life and ourselves, we can get offended all the time by other people because they're failing to recognize how wonderful who we are. And so those thoughts, being aware of them as they, and I'm sorry, I interrupted. Were you going to say something?
No, please
Roxanne?
continue.
Yeah.
No, continue.
I think it's helpful to name them, as part of the forgiveness process. If we can zero in and say, I'm struggling so much with this because of my problem with vainglory. That's super helpful. That it kind of sets things onto a realistic path instead of one in which we're so involved in our own self-defense. And with that, as the old monks would have said, guarding the heart, we don't let the passion of anger take root and grow and keep nurturing it and feeding it deliberately, because it feels good to be that mad. I think we are living right now in a society that's been absolutely divided along these lines of anger, and it's energizing to be mad. And I think we can get addicted to that feeling of, they're terrible. Look what they're doing, and we have to fight them or whatever. And That says a lot about our society. If we need the high of anger as much as we appear to, what is wrong at the heart of our culture that we're seeking, meaning in life by our kind of constant state of moral outrage? I would say a thing that really can help is just to acknowledge this is complicated. I'm complicated. Other people are complicated. God, I need you. I need you. I need you. And one of the beautiful prayers I learned to pray from the monks, which you probably pray too. Oh God, come to my assistance. Oh Lord, make haste to help me. And that you can pray that around the clock. And I think the beauty of that is it keeps putting it back into perspective. I am helpless to go through this whole difficult process of forgiving unless God is right there with me, and it takes away the sense of failure when we find it hard to forgive because, we have God to lean on. I think just very practically, it's to deliberately stop saying bad things about the person we're mad at. Just don't let our mouths say it. Begin praying for the well-being of the person we're angry with. And I think that's especially can really be a helpful thing in marriages because, boy, marriage is really, when you look at what an arena we enter together. I mean, we could be at war all the time with one another. This is the most intimate person in our lives. They know us better probably than anybody. They know what all of our triggers are. And we can do great damage to one another in a marriage, but we can also, through the loving partnership, just create beautiful things we could never do on our own. And so that business of praying for the welfare, the well-being of the person we're angry at, whether it's a spouse or whoever, it's really hard to sustain anger against a person you're praying for, I'd say on a daily, if not more often basis. Make it a practice of prayer for that person that's
it also makes it really hard to say anything negative about them when you're praying about them.
Exactly.
It changes your language, how you would articulate what happened if you're speaking to God about it as opposed to speaking to your head about it.
Exactly.
Paula, to kind of build on that, I mean, how do we know when we're just false forgiving? What is, I think sometimes we say that we're forgiving someone. We've forgiven them, Father Nick, or, you hear that sometimes, and then, but then you can tell that they're really not forgiving them. So let's talk a little bit about what false forgiveness is.
Yeah, I would say that the first one, it's an easy trap, is we just don't like being mad, and we just, we want to get over it, and we don't want to do all the hard work that it often takes to really genuinely forgive. So we do it kind of sentimentally because it just makes us feel better to think we've done it, and the hard part on that one is that often evidence soon arises that we haven't really forgiven yet. And it gets to be very frustrating because they can still trip the switch so easily. But that's kind of a sentimental forgiveness. The other kind, I think, is a particular temptation of serious Christians, which is to say, Jesus didn't give us a choice on this. Jesus said, you must forgive. This is not an optional thing here. This is one of my big commands. And so we forgive out of a kind of pious sense of duty. And we really truly believe that we have forgiven because we worked really hard at it and we did the right prayers and all that stuff. And then somehow that person comes along 2 months later and we realize we still want to kill them, And so it can become very discouraging. And one thing I had to learn it myself the hard way, but when I've had someone tell me that they are struggling so much to forgive and they just can't do it, I don't know if I'm advising them correctly, but I usually say, stop trying. Just let it go for right now. You're not there yet. Pray instead for the desire to forgive. Just stick with that stage for a while. And if you can do that sincerely, then help will come as you move deeper into the forgiveness process. But this is sometimes a very lengthy process. It's not something that just happens
I think
overnight.
that's important for listeners to really hear. I mean, if anybody were to rewind the last 10 minutes of what you described in terms of studying the self, the roots, the pieces of it that are ours, understanding them, really immersing into wanting to forgive, wanting to pray for them and their story. There's really a lot there. And this is why it takes time, to arrive at new perspectives and gain deeper clarity, and is seeing it as opportunities to learn about ourselves, about them, about the world, about our purpose. I mean, there really is a lot of depth and complexity that, it isn't something we can will ourselves into by tomorrow.
No.
And so for people battling long hurts, I think it's really important to sort of have the bigger picture of, okay, this is supposed to take time. I'm not doing it wrong. Like,
right,
it is supposed to take time.
Right. And, I think Roxanne, too, and Paul, I'd love to get your thoughts on this, but I mean, we have to recognize, too, that this is a spiritual battle, and all of us face these different spiritual battles, and that we oftentimes share that with our congregation and our church, that the enemy oftentimes plays on our greatest weakness. In other words, what area of our life we struggle with the most will oftentimes be where he attacks us. And, he's an opportunist. So if he knows that we're trying to be forgiving in this setting, then he'll say, well, okay, let me come from a different direction to try to get them to stumble. And I think that's so important to recognize that, it is a process, as you were both sharing and reminding ourselves, that the enemy's not going to simply let us go with that. He's going to continue to provide opportunities oftentimes through our thoughts and experiences, in which those thoughts of unforgiveness are going to continue to kind of plague us. So I think it's important.
And so much of it takes so much studying. I mean, if you think about it, it takes a lot of studying and sort of, coming apart, looking at it from the outside. But you can't be angry to do that. You can't be immersed in the emotion in order to study the emotion. You really have to be. I love a good night's rest. If I'm upset about something, there's something magical about the morning, that you have this tremendous insight and clarity that you may not have had just when you were upset or tired or hurt. And so, we really do have to have that time and space, and have to be a little bit scientific in the way we look at our pains. But I'd love a few words just to kind of give some couples who may be listening, some pointers for where to begin this huge process of forgiveness and reconciliation in a marriage where there may have been deep and lasting hurt.
Yeah, and I think the tough part about marriage, especially if it involves kids, is it gets very primitive. I mean, it gets to the deepest core of us when we feel, for example, so often in a marriage, it's one partner has in some way betrayed the other partner, and so there's a gap that's opened up, which partner one won't admit that my relationship with someone else, even if it's just a deep friendship, but I'm giving my best self to someone outside the marriage, usually has a narrative all in place to justify that. And so they're not willing to see that to get back into a zone where they could start working with their marital partner on the situation, they're going to have to give up that other relationship. It can't continue because it's drawing life blood, away from the partnership. Secondly would be, it's so tempting when there's family strife going on for parents to start leaning on children because they feel battered by, whatever the conflict is, the inability to communicate with their spouse right then because they're both too angry. And so they start letting that spill over. They start leaning on the little shoulders of children, and they'll say things, without even realizing what they're conveying sometimes. They don't intend maybe to tear down the other person, but it's coming across. I mean, especially with kids. One of my friends calls kids God's little spies. They pick up so much because their whole sense of security is tied up with their parents. And so to then be really, really cognizant of what's coming out by what's being conveyed, to people right in the heart of that family as the strife is continuing, is, I think, hugely important. And then we've already talked about starting to pray very deliberately for the well-being of this person that we're married to, which, as you were saying, Roxanne, helps to diminish the anger, because you can't sincerely pray for their well-being when you're angry. I think and this is probably kind of in marriage counseling too, but to try to start seeing that person as a stranger, someone that somehow or another you failed to get to know the first time around. So let's see who this is that I've been maybe living with for 22 years now. What have I missed in this whole thing? To see especially what it is that you find admirable, and try to focus on that, so that the tenor of the whole thing begins to shift more toward the positive. Those would just be some
I love
ideas.
those. I think that's such good wisdom. Paula, we only have about 3 minutes left of our show. I can't believe how
it went
quickly
by so fast
the show is going. Yes, I mean, and we definitely would love to have you back on our show to continue the conversation. But I think one of the things I'd love to leave our audience with is, why is it so essential? I mean, at the end of the day, why is it so essential for us to forgive? I mean, to not only for us spiritually, but emotionally, physically. I mean, talk to us a little bit about that in the remaining minutes of our show, about how important it is and how essential it is really to forgive.
Well, I think a good little thought exercise is to imagine a world in which no forgiveness ever takes place. I mean, it would be living in hell, literally. We could not even function if people weren't forgiving one another regularly on a daily basis. And so then also thinking about what are the most moving, beautiful stories we've ever heard. Almost invariably, they involve some kind of really sort of miraculous act of forgiveness. It speaks to the deepest part of us as moral beings, this ability to set aside maybe very justifiable anger and hurt for the greater good, for ourselves and for the people around us. And I think that, unforgiveness, it makes us both often physically sick, but for sure spiritually sick. There's something very wrong if we've continued to make this thing the centerpiece of our lives, and this is fulcrum around which everything else spins. There's no way that can really lead us into where we want to go, which the homeland of our hope, that's where we're headed, and so I think that's
I think that's so important, I think, for all of us to hear, because I think all of us, no matter if we've written a book or a priest, a psychologist, we all deal with times in which people offend us and hurt us, and sometimes those are just our wounded egos, and sometimes they're really sincere hurts. And I think one of the challenges that all of us need to recognize is that we recognize that this is at the core a spiritual battle that all of us face and that we'll face, and remembering that none of this can be done without Christ. I mean, this is not, we're not trying to tell us that we can do that forgiveness apart from Him, because really without Him, we, on our own strength, we'll allow our own thoughts to kind of lead us. And so in some ways, we're the last people that we need to be depending on to medicate ourselves or to help us through this process. And so we need Christ. And what, as you were beautifully saying with your book, but also in what you were sharing today, is how He modeled that for us. I mean, when he was on the cross, He was still acknowledging that forgive them, for they do not know what they're doing, and had this beautiful throughout the scriptures on the Sermon on the Mount, how important it was. We hear in the Lord's Prayer how important it is to forgive. And I just would encourage all of us that lean into God. Don't allow unforgiveness to be the king over your life, as we oftentimes talk about on the show. Make it be Christ. We can't worship two masters. You can't say I love God but still elevate unforgiveness and anger to that point. And I love that moment you shared earlier, just about pray to want to. Like, if you're struggling, God has this
an amazing ability to change hearts, softening them, opening them to new ways. And so I do think when people are really, really struggling with it, that was just so simple to remember, just immerse yourself in prayer to actually want to, and God will allow the shift. In all the beautiful ways that he does these things. But it's always evident, his hand in these processes where he changes hearts. And so what a simple thing to remember, and how to kind of bring him in at that moment of our own resistance.
Paula, thank you so much for being with us tonight.
You're so welcome.
It's such a blessing to have you with us.
Such a blessing.
Look forward to having you on our show for sure. If you write a new book, let us know. We definitely would love to talk to you about that. But you have to check out her new book, friends. It's called Forgiveness, Following Jesus into Radical Loving. Again, Forgiveness, Following Jesus into Radical Loving. You can find it at Paraclete Press, also on Amazon as well. But Paula, what a great show. I'm sure it's going to be beneficial to a lot of people. And so again, thanks so much.
Thank you. You're very welcome, both of you. It's been really great. Thank you.
Absolutely. And we just and remind all of you that our show will be available as a podcast. So if you're watching this on podcast and you find it beneficial, do us a favor and share it with your friends and family. We also encourage you also to make sure that you register for our daily inspirational messages by going to our website, thelouhs.com, and join us next Tuesday for a brand new Live with the Louhs. God bless you all, and stay strong in your faith.
We're back with Live with the Louhs and Father Nick. Father Nick and Dr. Roxanne are the authors of their books Renewing You, A Priest, a Psychologist, and a Plan, and 6 Hours, 7 Lessons, How Christ's Light Transcends Our Darkness, which can be purchased at store.ancientfaith.com. Their daily inspirational messages can be found at thelouhs.com/subscribe. Be sure also to search for The Louhs on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. Live with the Louhs is a listener-supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.